right, great. Good afternoon. I'm Director Mike Williams, and as you may know, I oversee all the divisions involved in investigations conducted by JSO. This is Sergeant Bill Whitney of our Economic Crimes Unit. Thank you all for coming today. Last fall, we stood up and talked to you about the issue of adverse possession, whereby people renting out property they did not legally own to some unsuspecting tenants. These people had applied for property under adverse possession rules that had been on the books for years, but make no mistake about it, appropriating someone's house when you don't own it and then using it as your own rental property is unlawful. Since that time, we worked closely with Representative Daniel Davis, a Florida House member from Jacksonville, who successfully crafted legislation that defines if and when someone other than a mortgage holder can take possession of a property. Since that time, we've also been monitoring and investigating all applications of adverse possession. Yesterday, we arrested Rosemary McCoy and Elton McCall. Both were arrested on a variety of charges related to their involvement in an adverse possession scheme. In October of last year, the suspects applied for adverse possession of 7 properties in Duval County and began renting those properties under the company name of Going Global to unsuspecting tenants. Our investigation was led by Sergeant Whitney and detectives Jim Baxley and Heather Stevens of our Economic Crimes Unit. They looked into the legitimacy of these 7 applications, and during the course of the investigation, the suspects applied for adverse possession of 6 more properties and began to attempt to rent those homes out as well. These detectives conducted their investigation, and with the cooperation and guidance from the State Attorney's Office and assistance from the Clay County Sheriff's Office, these suspects were arrested yesterday on a variety of charges. And those charges include racketeering, influence, corrupt organizations, or RICO, conspiracy to commit RICO, organized schemes to defraud, grand theft, and burglary and trespass. And the PIO has that information and those mugshots for you after the conference. In July, the new legislation I mentioned will take effect, and it will make it harder for people to abuse the law and make it easier for us to build and prosecute cases of these criminal enterprises. Again, we want to publicly thank Representative Davis for his leadership in Tallahassee in getting this legislation passed. He could not be with us today, but he welcomes any calls with questions about the bill today. And I want to thank Sergeant Whitney and his team for their relentless hard work. And in closing, let me say, we will not conduct some legal negotiation when it comes to adverse possessions and people who use that as a means to defraud. We do not view this as a civil case. If you're involved in an adverse possession con game, we will conduct a criminal investigation and we will make an arrest. So with that, I'll open it up to a few questions.
So you flag these as soon as they show up at the city office and then investigate to see whether or not it actually falls within the rules?
Yes, sir. We do.
This Going Global, was this an actual storefront that they had? How are they working with the tenants, and how do the tenants go about their renting process?
And I'll let Sergeant Whitney get into some of the details. I'll tell you this, they were representing themselves as a management company and offering these properties to, again, unsuspecting renters.
How much for rent?
Market value, probably.
Usually market value between $700 and $1,000 per house. Per month.
If you are a renter, how do you make sure you don't fall into a trap like this? What can you do to make sure you don't rent from somebody who's
right?
loaded?
Well, and in these cases right now, the real property owners, the banks, they're working with some of these people who got into these properties. Some of these people may stay. They may rent the properties from the banks, and others may have to leave and rent another property. So the real owners of the properties are working with those tenants, to allow them an opportunity to either stay or get housing elsewhere.
Why were these homes empty? Were they foreclosed or?
Bill, most of them, I'm assuming, were foreclosed.
Yes, sir. Most of them were in the foreclosure process or were already foreclosed upon, and the bank had taken over ownership. The ones that were still in the process, it took a great deal of investigatory time for my detectives because we have a deed holder, a mortgagee, who we have to find who's not going to leave their contact information behind when they walk away from the house and abandon it. So it takes a great deal of time for us to try to track that person down and verify that they have in fact abandoned the home. So yeah, most of these houses are abandoned, and we have to figure out who's actually the deed holder or if it's actually the foreclosure process hasn't been completed yet.
And that's the value of the new legislation. It will clean that up for us so that it won't be quite as complicated to build this case on these individuals who are, again, this almost defies common sense that someone can take somebody else's property, put a new lock on the door, and then rent it out to somebody else. So again, the new legislation will clean that up and allow us to make these cases quicker and make it a cleaner case for us.
Any idea how much money they made over time? It was about a 1 year period, you said last July? That's when they started?
They started last October.
October.
We don't have a figure on how much money they've actually made off the run from that point till now. We don't know.
Any other questions?
How is this investigation in tandem with the new legislation that begins next month? How is that going to benefit renters here in the first place?
Well, again, it'll make this type of case that we build easier to make. It cleans it up for us, making an easier path to build the case, easier path to prosecution.
What was the tenant's reaction when they found out that this place, that they're paying rent to some, could you step over and get on the mic there? What was the tenant's reaction when they found out that they were selling it to people who didn't own the
Well,
house?
they're completely unsuspecting. A lot of times we have families like military families come into town. They've been transferred to a local base here, and they bring their wife and kids, and they've got a new home to rent, and all of a sudden they find out from the police that the people that they're paying rent to don't even own the home. They're being provided a rental agreement by somebody who doesn't even own a property, and so of course they're extremely surprised, and rightfully so.
Is there anything, any red flags that pop up as far as cable companies, water companies, any kind of utilities in the house? How does that work?
Well, that's one red flag. As a matter of fact, the suspects in this individual case want to maintain electricity and cable in their name so that it appears that they're occupying the property. So they will have the renters pay them for the utilities, and then they'll pay the utility companies. One important note I want to bring to your attention is a lot of these renters get into these homes through things like Craigslist and fraudulent real estate websites. So someone had asked about how they can be more careful in getting into these types of situations. Anytime you get into, especially if you're coming from another state, if you get into an agreement with someone over Craigslist, we have a great number of scams that are occurring on Craigslist. This is just one of them. So just be extremely careful when you're talking with somebody, and do your due diligence, and maybe even follow up with the property appraiser's website to find out who the owner of the property is.
How do you tell if it's a fraudulent website? I mean, what would give that away?
There's no telltale way to tell if it's a fraudulent website. The safest thing to do is to check with the property appraiser, find out who the actual owner of that property is.
Any other questions?
Your first and last name again, I'm sorry.
Sergeant Bill Whitney, with the Economic Crimes Unit.
So just to be clear, 6 properties, but they have filed for adverse possession for another 7 more.
7 and then 6.
7 and then 6.
So, and again, I want to thank Representative Davis for his hard work on that new legislation, and Sergeant Whitney and his team